We start our programme in France, where officials say nearly 1,000 protesters were arrested in a fourth night of rioting after the police shooting of 17-year-old Nahel M in a Parisian suburb. Overnight, the Interior Minister claimed that there had been a downturn in the violence. Well, the unrest broke out in several cities, notably in Marseille, in the south of the country. Video footage showing streets on fire and shops, including a gun store, being attacked and looted by rioters. Well, despite the deployment of 45,000 police officers right across the country, the violence continued, including in the capital, Paris. And further afield, French media reported riots breaking out in French Caribbean territories, where at least one person was reportedly killed. The French football star and captain of the national team, Kylian Mbappe, has called for calm, saying violence solves nothing and that it should be replaced with mourning, dialogue and reconstruction. The police officer involved in the death of the teenager on Tuesday has been charged with voluntary homicide. Nahel's funeral will be held later in his hometown of Nanterre, a suburb northwest of the capital. The family have requested journalists and the public to stay away. Regina Vaidyanathan begins our coverage.
Across France, yet more rage. Streets under siege. A dramatic outpouring of anger after a 17-year-old, Nahel, was killed by police during a traffic stop. Many of the rioters are teenagers, out despite a plea from France's president to parents to keep their children at home.
As the protests have intensified, so too has the police presence. Across the country from Friday into Saturday morning, more than 45,000 officers were deployed. And it's the police that is driving people onto the streets in the first place. Many here accuse officers of discrimination. And even the UN says that France needs to address its deep-rooted issues of racism in the police force.
It's a concern crowds at this protest share. The country's foreign ministry says the UN's claims are unfounded, but the French police have long been plagued by accusations of racism. Many see this violence as a wake-up call, but for the government, containing it's a challenge. What began with the death of Nahel has now come to represent something bigger. Regina Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Paris.
Well, our Europe editor, Katya Adler, has an update for us from Nanterre, where the funeral for 17-year-old Nahel is set to take place today.
I'm in Nanterre. That is an area outside Paris where Nahel, the 17-year-old unarmed boy who was shot and killed by a French policeman earlier this week at a traffic stop, lived and died. As you say, his funeral will be taking place in a few hours' time. And again last night, it was the scene of destruction. You can see these burnt out cars behind me. Fireworks were set off at the police overnight. It was a loud night and a loud morning because the authorities here are trying to clear up the mess ahead of the funeral. Nahel's family has appealed for calm, and so has France's national football team. They say it's tragic what happened here, and that working class suburbs like this, where many people come from minority backgrounds, are suffering and have grievances, including, they allege police brutality and daily discrimination. But they say this is not the way to deal with that. But these youth say they don't have a choice. This is the only way they're getting their voices heard. The French president hasn't imposed a state of emergency, but there are calls from the right and the far right in France and from some police unions to do exactly that, whereas the left and far left in France are saying he hasn't done enough to deal with the social problems in housing estates like this. So he's under fire politically and on the streets of France. He talks about getting the situation under control, but there's no sign of that right now.
Katya, very quickly before we leave you, in terms of motivations, the conversation has moved on somewhat with allegations, I think, by Mr. Macron himself, saying that social media is playing a part now in inciting that violence. Is there any clear indication as to how this is being coordinated or who's leading some of these riots and these protests? And people are now saying, it's moved on from the death of Nahel and it's more gratuitous now.
Well, no, it's not moved on, if you like, but if you talk to youths here, they'll say, we face discrimination by police every day, but nobody listens to us. When it's recorded, when someone holds up a phone and records it, it's irrefutable evidence. And what you have here about the killing of Nahel was that originally the policeman who shot him said that he felt that his life and the life of his colleague was in danger by Nahel. But when you had a look at that video, it clearly was not. And I think that helped trigger the outrage in areas like this, just like we saw after the death of George Floyd in the United States a couple of years ago, where a white policeman put his foot on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes, after which he died. When you have this being passed around on social media, it is a reminder to people who feel discriminated against, who feel underprivileged in society, that they are right to feel outraged and they want to do something about it. As I say again, though, the rioters on the street are very young, and a lot of people in this neighbourhood say they sympathise with the youngsters, but violence is not their thing. So it would be wrong to say the entire neighbourhoods like this are out there saying go and burn things. That is not the case. But for the youths themselves, they say they want their voices heard. We do, though, see instances of looting as well across the country, and that clearly is a separate issue to those who say they're protesting in the name of Nahel and others like him.
Well, that was Katja Adler in Nanterre. Another town that was city that was affected by the violence is in the north of France, in Lyon. From there, here's Sophia Betitza.
I'm in Roubaix, which is a suburb of Lille, one of the poorest parts of France. The situation here is still tense. Overnight, about 70 people were arrested in this area. And there was a curfew imposed in some neighborhoods here, a curfew over unaccompanied minors. Because, of course, so many of the people that have been rioting are very young, some as young as 13. Now, behind me, you can see what remains of a building. This used to be an office building. About 500 people worked here, and it was a really important part of this community. Now, some protesters broke in the middle of the night and set the whole building on fire. We can still see and smell the smoke. Across the street, there's a pharmacy, which is also a health center, and it's one of very few places where people from this community could go and get treatment if they were ill, and that was looted and partially destroyed. So, you know, this morning, so many people here have told us, what is the point of attacking pharmacies, offices, theatres? The feeling is that this is just not the right way to demand justice for Nahel.
And that was Sophia Betitza in the north of France.